You picture a wildfire as something that happens to a place. Smoke rises, trees fall, then eventually it ends. That is the story most people carry in their heads. But a Canadian wildfire does not end when the flames go out. It starts a second event, quieter and much longer, made of budgets, contracts, insurance claims, and rebuilding invoices. That second event is a business, and it is one of the fastest growing businesses in the country. So what does it actually cost to run a wildfire? Start with the machinery, because that is where the money begins. Fighting a modern Canadian wildfire means fielding water bombers, helicopters, bulldozers, hose lays, retardant drops, and thousands of firefighters move from province to province like a traveling workforce. Provinces do not own enough of this equipment to fight a bad season alone. Most air tanker fleets are leased or contracted through private operators on standby agreements, paid whether they fly or not, then paid again at a premium for every hour in the air once a fire actually breaks out. Seasonal firefighters are hired in waves each spring, trained in weeks, then deployed wherever the danger rating climbs fastest. It is, in effect, a temporary national workforce, built and dismantled every single year. None of that is cheap, and none of it is optional once a fire crosses a certain size. British Columbia alone spent roughly $770 million fighting fires in the 2023 season, on a path to a total near $966 million for that fiscal year, once every related cost was added in. That single line item added an extra $2.5 billion to the province's deficit projection. One fire season, one provincial budget, permanently reshaped. Now widen the lens. Across the whole country, wildfire suppression costs surpassed $1.5 billion in 2023. That is before health spending, before insurance payouts, before a single new home is rebuilt. Ontario's wildfire-related health costs alone were estimated near $1.28 billion in a short window that same year, driven largely by smoke exposure, sending people to hospitals with respiratory complaints. Add insurance losses of more than $945 million nationally for 2023, and you start to see the shape of an economy that exists entirely because forests are burning. Doesn't that sound like a business plan nobody would ever choose to write down on purpose? To understand why the costs keep climbing, you have to go back further than any single season. Wildfire protection spending in Canada has risen by roughly $150 million per decade since the 1970s, according to reporting compiled by journalist Don Pitties. What used to be a seasonal, manageable expense has become a structural, permanent one. Annual wildfire costs now regularly exceed $1 billion a year for the federal and provincial governments combined. That is not a spike. That is a new baseline. And baselines, once set, rarely move back down. Here is where the real business model starts to take shape, because a wildfire touches almost every sector of the economy at once, and each sector responds differently. Take 2016, the Fort McMurray fire in Alberta. It forced the largest evacuation in Canadian history, pushed 85,000 people out of their homes, and destroyed more than 2,400 structures. The estimated total cost, once you add direct damage, health impacts, and lost economic output, was close to $9 billion, according to research from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. That single fire also knocked measurable percentage points off national GDP for that quarter. Because Fort McMurray sits inside Canada's oil sands region, and oil sands production had to shut down while the fire burned. That detail matters more than it first appears. Economists at Royal Bank of Canada estimated that 2 weeks of oil sands shutdowns from the Fort McMurray fire alone could subtract half a percentage point from that month's GDP. RBC's forecast for that quarter was cut from 1.5% growth down to 0.5%. Almost entirely because of one wildfire hundreds of kilometers from any stock exchange. A forest fire moved a national growth forecast. Sit with that for a second. What other natural event can do that to an entire country's economy in a matter of weeks? The oil sands story repeated itself in 2023. Wildfires again disrupted production across Alberta, and TD Bank economist Brian DePrato noted in a research report that the resulting hit to oil output, once it reversed, helped the economy rebound sharply in the following quarter. Statistics Canada later confirmed the second quarter of that year was one of the weakest since the financial crisis, driven heavily by wildfire disruption to crude output, agriculture, and forestry and logging, which fell more than 4% in a single quarter. Fishing and hunting activity fell nearly 10% for the same reason. An entire cross-section of Canada's resource economy interrupted by smoke. Oxford Economics ran the numbers on that same season and estimated wildfires had already shaved roughly a tenth of a percentage point off national GDP by the second quarter, with a worst-case scenario of 3 to 6/10 of a point by the third quarter if the season kept breaking records. For comparison, their analysis noted that was potentially a larger hit than the 2016 Fort McMurray fires produced on their own. Two different fires, 7 years apart, and economists reaching for the same handful of tools each time. Mining, oil and gas extraction, construction, and consumer confidence, all treated as exposed line items on a national balance sheet whenever the smoke rolls in. So who actually profits while all of this is happening? This is the part of the business model people rarely think about. Air tanker operators and helicopter charter companies sign seasonal government contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Contracts that scale up automatically as fire danger ratings rise. Retardant manufacturers see order volumes spike. Temporary camp and catering companies set up entire mobile cities to house thousands of firefighters for weeks at a time, complete with kitchens, laundry, and medical tents. Heavy equipment rental firms lease bulldozers and water trucks at premium seasonal rates. None of these companies want fires to happen. But once a fire starts, each of them earns revenue directly tied to how long it burns and how many resources it demands. That is not a coincidence. That is a market responding exactly the way markets respond to demand. The labor side of this business deserves its own line item too. Seasonal wildland firefighters in Canada are often hired on short-term contracts, paid a base rate that looks modest on paper, then compensated heavily through overtime and hazard pay once a fire season turns severe. A brutal summer can nearly double a firefighter's annual income compared with a quiet one, which means the workforce itself has a financial incentive baked into bad conditions, even though almost none of these workers would ever wish for a worse season. Provinces also lean on mutual aid agreements, borrowing crews from other provinces and occasionally from the United States and Australia, paying for their flights, lodging, and wages for the duration of the deployment. When a fire season overwhelms one province, the labor market for firefighting effectively becomes national and sometimes international, almost overnight. Isn't it strange that the workers most essential to containing the damage are paid more, the worse that damage gets? The rebuilding phase creates its own separate economy, one that arrives months after the flames are out and lasts for years afterward. Construction contractors, electricians, and building suppliers see demand surge in fire-affected regions, often faster than local labor markets can supply workers, which pushes wages and material costs upward at the exact moment displaced families can least afford it. Real estate in some rebuilt communities eventually rebounds to, or past, pre-fire values once new infrastructure and updated building codes are in place. That rebound is often framed as a resilient success story. It is also, quietly, a second wave of economic activity generated entirely by destruction, flowing to a different set of businesses than the ones who profited during the suppression phase. Then there is the industry standing on the other side of the ledger entirely: insurance. The Insurance Bureau of Canada tracks every major weather-related loss in the country, and its Vice President of Climate Change and Federal Issues, Craig Stewart, has been blunt about where this is heading. Wildfire and flood risk, he has said, is becoming harder and harder for ordinary Canadians to insure at an affordable price. In 2023, 2 wildfires in British Columbia's Okanagan and Shuswap regions alone caused more than $720 million in insured losses, making them the 10th worst insured disaster in Canadian history at the time. Across the entire country that year, natural catastrophes caused more than $3.1 billion in insured damage, the 4th most expensive year ever recorded. Aaron Sutherland, another vice president at the same bureau, pointed out that 2023's wildfire season broke every record for land burned and property damaged in British Columbia specifically. Records, once broken this consistently, stop being records and start being trends. Put Canada's numbers next to its southern neighbor, and the scale becomes even clearer. A report from the United States Congress Joint Economic Committee estimated that climate-exacerbated wildfires cost the American economy somewhere between $394 billion and $893 billion every single year. Once property damage, health impacts, lost income, and long-term watershed and infrastructure damage are all factored in. Canada's totals are smaller only because its population and built environment are smaller. Per hectare burned, and per community exposed, the underlying cost structure looks remarkably similar on both sides of the border. Suppression spending that rises every decade, insurance losses that keep breaking records, and health and productivity costs that dwarf the suppression bill itself once they are fully counted. Neither country has found a way to make the ledger shrink. This is the first hidden trap in the wildfire business. Insurance affordability is quietly becoming a crisis of its own. Nearly 1.9 million buildings across Canada sit directly exposed to wildfire risk, with more than 6% of them classified as high to very high risk according to disaster risk analysis compiled for the United Nations. As insurers pay out more every single year, premiums rise for everyone, not just people living in forested areas. Some homeowners in high-risk zones are starting to find wildfire coverage difficult to obtain at any price. What happens to a housing market when insurance quietly becomes optional in name only, but unaffordable in practice? That question does not have a clean answer yet, and that is exactly the problem. The second hidden trap sits inside the forestry industry itself, one of Canada's largest employers and one of the sectors most directly reshaped by fire. When a forest burns, standing timber does not simply disappear from the economy. It becomes salvage wood, harvested quickly before it degrades, sold at a discount into a lumber market that is simultaneously losing supply. That sounds almost like an opportunity. It is not. The Business Development Bank of Canada noted in a 2023 report that severe fire damage to forests reduces long-term wood supply and pushes lumber prices upward, even while the salvage wood is briefly flooding local markets. Export data backs this up directly. During the 2023 Okanagan and Shuswap fires, British Columbia's lumber shipments to the United States and Mexico dropped 20% year-over-year, even as the province's total freight volume barely moved. The forest industry does not just lose trees. It loses trade relationships, shipping contracts, and years of future harvest all at once. And research from Lindsay and Pillai in 2024 has pointed out that this employer, more than most, absorbs damage that shows up years later in reduced harvest volumes rather than in the fire season itself. There is a third hidden cost, one that never shows up on a suppression budget line at all: smoke. Air quality does not respect provincial borders or fire perimeters, which means the economic damage from wildfire smoke often lands in places that never saw a single flame. A study by Visit California, cited by economists analyzing Canada's own wildfire seasons, found that 11% of potential travelers canceled trips during that state's record 2017 fire season purely because of smoke and air quality warnings. Canada has seen the same pattern. The Conference Board of Canada's monthly Consumer Confidence Index slumped to its worst reading of the year in June 2023, weighed down heavily by falling sentiment in Alberta, where the fire impact was most severe that spring. Construction crews lose safe working days outdoors. Outdoor tourism operators lose bookings weeks in advance, canceled by travelers who have never even seen the region's fire map. The wildfire economy, in other words, has a shadow that stretches across the entire country, invisible on any suppression invoice, but very visible in a hotel's occupancy rate 3 provinces away. There's a carbon accounting angle to this business too, one that connects directly back to climate policy without needing to take a side in that debate to understand the numbers. Canada's forests are counted as carbon sinks in national climate accounting, storing carbon as they grow. A megafire season converts millions of hectares of stored carbon into atmospheric emissions almost overnight, which complicates any projection built around forests absorbing carbon over time. Companies and governments that rely on forestry-based carbon credits or offset programs have to treat every fire season as a live risk to the credits they're counting on, not a hypothetical one. A forest that burns is a forest that stops earning whatever value was assigned to the carbon it was storing. And in some programs, that loss has to be replaced or written down. That is one more balance sheet, alongside government budgets and insurance ledgers, that a wildfire season can quietly rewrite. Zoom out to the historical trend, because this is not just about any one bad year. The 2023 wildfire season burned approximately 17.6 million hectares across Canada, more than double the previous record set in 1989. The 2025 season had already burned over 8.3 million hectares by early September, on pace to become the second worst on record. Each of these seasons emits enormous amounts of carbon in the process. The 2023 fires alone released close to 480 megatons, nearly 5 times the 20-year average, and accounted for nearly a quarter of all wildfire carbon emissions on the planet that year. That single detail should reframe how you think about the phrase forest fire. This is not a local event. It is a global-scale emission source that happens to also be a national economic event. Now compare two provinces that lived through the same season very differently. Quebec's 2023 wildfires burned 4.3 million hectares, the worst season the province had seen in over a century, with 713 individual fires, almost all sparked by lightning. 27,000 people were evacuated across 26 municipalities and indigenous communities. A provincially funded study by the climate consulting firm Nautica later put the total economic cost above $8 billion. Once forestry disruption, mining slowdowns, business losses, and healthcare costs linked to wildfire smoke were all added together. British Columbia's 2023 season, by contrast, burned less land in total, but produced the costliest single insured event the province had ever recorded, at $720 million, because more of what burned sat closer to homes and communities rather than remote forest. Same country, same summer, two completely different cost structures, shaped entirely by where the fire happened to spread. Quebec's bill was dominated by industrial disruption across forestry and mining regions far from major cities. British Columbia's bill was dominated by residential and small business losses concentrated in a handful of communities. Doesn't that tell you something about how much geography quietly controls the price tag on a disaster? A fire burning through unpopulated boreal forest and a fire burning through the edge of a town produce wildly different invoices, even when the flame itself behaves almost identically. The human geography of these fires carries its own economic weight, one that standard GDP figures rarely capture well. Indigenous communities are disproportionately represented among the people evacuated every wildfire season, often located in remote areas with a single access road, limited emergency housing capacity, and local economies built around small businesses, tourism lodges, or forestry work that can take years to reopen after a major fire passes through. Quebec's 2023 season alone forced evacuations across indigenous communities alongside 26 municipalities, disrupting livelihoods that do not always show up cleanly in provincial economic data, because so much of that activity sits outside large-scale industrial statistics. A national suppression budget can be measured in the billions. The lost income of a single lodge owner, a single trap line, or a single small outfitter in a remote community rarely gets measured at all, even though it is just as real to the person living it. The federal government's own disaster assistance numbers reveal a third layer to this business model. The Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program paid out roughly $1.7 billion between 2016 and 2021 alone, with average annual assistance sitting near $340 million a year, even before recent record-breaking seasons are factored in. That money flows toward rebuilding roads, bridges, and communication infrastructure damaged by fire, spending that governments frame as resilience investment. And in fairness, some of it works exactly that way. Analysis compiled for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction found that Canada's broader economy has shown a genuine ability to recover from wildfire shocks, partly because of this continued infrastructure spending. Resilience, in other words, is itself a line item in the wildfire economy, funded specifically because the alternative is repeated, uncontained collapse in the hardest-hit regions. But resilience spending has an opportunity cost that rarely makes headlines. Research from RBC Economics calculated that the roughly $5 billion in total damage from 2016, most of it tied to the Fort McMurray fire, represented close to 14% of Canada's entire research and development spending for that year. Money spent rebuilding what already existed is money that cannot simultaneously fund new investment, new technology, or new productivity growth. Rebuilding supports jobs in the short term. It rarely builds anything new in the long term. That is the quiet trade-off sitting underneath every recovery announcement. And it is the same trade-off that shows up after every major flood, storm, or fire season the country records. There's a monetary policy angle here, too, one that almost never reaches the public conversation, but shapes it anyway. Thibault Dupree, a senior director at the Bank of Canada, whose research focuses specifically on the economic impact of natural disasters, has helped document how wildfire seasons distort short-term GDP data badly enough to complicate interest rate decisions. When smoke and evacuation temporarily shut down oil extraction, agriculture, and construction all at once, the resulting GDP dip can look like a broader economic slowdown, even when it is not one. Ryan Ness, Director of Adaptation at the Canadian Climate Institute, has pushed for GDP at-risk estimates specifically for wildfire-exposed regions, because the current numbers still understate how concentrated the damage really is. Central bankers, in other words, now have to factor forest fires into decisions about the price of borrowing money for the entire country. That is how deeply this has been absorbed into the machinery of the national economy. So what does the exit path lead? Not toward fewer fires, unfortunately. Every projection compiled across insurance, banking, and disaster risk research points toward more frequent, more severe seasons, not fewer. The exit path instead runs through economic diversification and risk sharing. The Insurance Bureau of Canada has spent years pushing Ottawa toward a national flood and wildfire insurance program, similar to systems already running in parts of Europe, designed to spread catastrophic risk across the whole country rather than concentrating it on homeowners in the highest-risk postal codes. Progress on that program has been slower than the industry wanted, according to the Bureau's own public statements, even as the underlying risk keeps compounding every summer. At the community level, the exit path looks like fire-smart programs, defensible space requirements around homes, and building codes that account for ember exposure rather than just direct flame contact. At the industry level, it looks like forestry operations diversifying into salvage logging technology, faster kiln-drying methods for fire-damaged timber, and insurance products specifically underwritten for wildfire-adjacent construction. At the government level, it looks like shifting some spending from pure suppression, fighting fires after they start, toward prevention and fuel management, clearing the dead wood and dense underbrush that turn a manageable fire into a megafire in the first place. None of these are complete solutions. All of them are, in effect, businesses building themselves around a permanent risk that used to be occasional. Some of this shift is already visible in how provinces plan their budgets. Rather than treating firefighting as a single emergency line item approved after the fact, a growing number of wildfire management agencies are building multi-year prevention contracts directly into their base budgets, treating fuel reduction crews and control burns as an ongoing service rather than a reaction. That is a meaningful change in how the business is financed, moving a portion of the spending from unpredictable emergency appropriations into predictable planned procurement. Predictable spending is easier for private contractors to plan around too, which is part of why equipment suppliers and forestry contractors have started lobbying for exactly this kind of multi-year commitment. A more stable contract pipeline benefits everyone selling into this economy, even if it does very little to change how much any single season ultimately costs once a truly severe year arrives. Tourism operators in fire-prone regions have started adapting their own business models around this uncertainty as well. building flexible cancellation policies, shoulder season promotions, and smoke contingency refund plans directly into their pricing, essentially treating wildfire risk the same way a coastal resort treats hurricane season. Lodges, outfitters, and small hospitality businesses in British Columbia's interior and parts of Quebec's forested regions now openly market their properties around clear air guarantees or partial refunds tied to air quality index thresholds, a level of built-in disaster planning that simply did not exist in tourism marketing a decade ago. That is a small, almost invisible sign of an entire regional economy quietly restructuring itself around a risk it has decided is now permanent rather than occasional. Here is the choice this leaves you with, whether you live in a city apartment far from any forest or in a small town at the edge of the tree line. Every dollar spent on wildfire suppression, insurance, and rebuilding is a dollar not spent somewhere else, in your taxes, your premiums, your grocery prices when lumber and agriculture costs ripple through supply chains, even in your travel plans when a smoke-filled sky cancels a trip you booked months in advance. You do not get to opt out of this economy just because your own home has never been near a fire line. The only real choice is whether you understand where that money is actually going and whether the system's being built right now. The insurance reforms, the prevention funding, the building codes are being built fast enough to keep up with a risk that keeps growing every single season. You still picture a wildfire as something that happens to a place, smoke rising, trees falling, and then, eventually, ending. But now you know better. It never really ends. It just changes shape, moving from flame into invoice, into premium, into forecast, into a permanent, growing business that every Canadian is already paying into, whether they have ever seen a single fire or not.